Hello friends. First of all, I would like to say that today is the Independence Day of India, an independence of freedom that was achieved after a hell lot of sacrifices, that was achieved out of a long struggle for almost 200 years of barbaric colonial rule of the Britishers. Today, every part of India is celebrating and remembering the heroes who have laid down their lives, the sacrifices that were made, and that too, irrespective of gender and age. But today in this video, I would like to say that what did the foreigners thought about India in 1947? When India became free, what did the world think would happen to India? What did the world expect from India in 1947? It's a different kind of a documentary where we will try to understand the answers as to what did the foreigners, particularly the Western people, thought about India when India became independent. Well, it was 15th of August 1947 when India was finally free. But for a while, imagine that you were not an Indian and you were standing thousands of miles away. Maybe you were a journalist in London or a diplomat in Washington or even a correspondent in Delhi, or rather a photographer traveling through Punjab. And suddenly, after nearly 200 years of British barbaric rule, India was becoming independent. What would you have thought? Would you have seen the birth of a new democracy? Or rather, a fragile country that might collapse? Or a civilization that finally returning to the world stage? Or a country being born in the middle of one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the 20th century? Because when foreigners observed India in 1947, they did not see one India. They saw several. For example, questions like, could this enormous yet poor and extraordinarily diverse country would actually govern itself? Could democracy even survive here? Could the Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs and dozens of other communities, plenty of different languages, cultures will remain inside one functioning state? Could India remain united? And perhaps the most important question would be that what would India become? And the answer actually surprised many of them. Because in 1947, when the world was not simply watching India becoming independent, the world was actually watching an experiment. An experiment involving hundreds of millions of people, and nobody knew how it would end. Well, first, imagine the image of an independent India. Now, to understand what foreigners or the Western people saw, we have to go back to the night of the 14th and 15th of August, 1947. At around 11:30 at night, when New Delhi was actually preparing for something the world had never seen before, Robert Trumbull, the New York Times correspondent, was actually there. And he was not reading about Indian independence from New York. He was actually standing in Delhi. He watched the crowd gathered around the government buildings. Public buildings were illuminated. The streets were decorated with colors of the new Indian flag. And inside the Constituent Assembly, something extraordinary was about to happen. At around 11 p.m., the Constituent Assembly began its special session. And finally came the midnight. The clock moved towards 12. India was no longer under British rule. And according to Trumbull's report, when the midnight moment arrived, the members of the assembly sat in silence and listening to the chimes. There was a conch shell which was blown, and the silence was broke eventually. And the room was erupted in celebration. India had become free. But notice something here. The foreign journalist was not describing a country simply descending into chaos. He was actually watching a political transfer of power taking inside an institution. There was ceremony, there was constitutional procedures, there was symbolism, there was politics, and there was something else that could be, if I'm allowed to say, that is expectations. The world outside understood that something much bigger than the end of British rule might be happening. The British Empire was retreating, but what would replace it? That's the question. Here was the first great problem. Well, India wanted democracy, but from the outside, India did not look like the easiest place in the world to build one. Think about the circumstances. Hundreds of millions of people, enormous linguistic diversity, religious diversity, deep caste divisions, and widespread poverty, low literacy, and a largely rural population, hundreds of princely states, and now even partition. The creation of India and Pakistan had actually displaced millions of people, and there was communal violence, which had actually killed hundreds of people. This was not the clean beginning of a new nation. It was a nation trying to build itself while millions were running for their lives. Later, scholarships has described the creation of universal adult franchise as one of the greatest democratic experiments in the human history. The practical challenge was enormous. The electorate would ultimately include people who had never before participated in a democratic national election. The process was being constructed while the country was dealing with partition, dealing with refugees, illiteracy, poverty, and political integration. And this is where the foreign question becomes fascinating, because many outside observers were not automatically convinced that democracy could work in India. For generations, one of the ideological justifications of colonial rule had been that the countries like India were not yet capable of governing themselves. And now India was essentially saying that we will govern ourselves, and not just through a small educated elite, but through mass democracy. And that was, my friend, a radical claim. Well, there was another India, a much darker one. While Delhi celebrated independence, Punjab was burning. The creation of new borders had transformed ordinary people into refugees. People who had lived in one place for generations were suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a new border. Hindus moved towards India and Sikhs moved towards India, while the Muslims majorly moved towards Pakistan. And millions carried whatever they could. Some traveled in train, some by bullock cart, some actually walked, and some even carried children, and some carried their elder parents. And largely, people carried almost nothing. Margaret Book, American photographer, was actually working for life, traveled through the world. Her photographs became one of the most powerful visual records of partition. She photographed refugee caravans, families carrying their possessions, people sheltering in Delhi's Purana Killa, hospitals, diseases, starvation, and deaths. And one of the most haunting stories associated with her photographs concern a 4-year-old boy named Mansoor. Well, his family had been caught in the chaos of migration. They had hoped to travel by train, but the journey was blocked. Food and water became scarce. And unfortunately, Mansoor, a 4-year-old kid, he died. She photographed the family burying him. This is important, because if you only show the famous midnight speech, you show one version of 1947. But if you show Book White's photographs, you will see another India. The outside world was watching a country celebrating freedom while simultaneously witnessing the human consequences of partition, and the contradiction would define the foreign perceptions of India. Imagine being a foreign correspondent in 1947. You just watched Britain leave, but the new country is facing partition, the problems of refugee, communal violence, princely states, Kashmir, the economic weaknesses, the food shortages, administrative disruptions, and the enormous task of building a political system. So the question was not simply, is India independent? It was, will India remain India? Could the country stay united? Could its political institution survive? Could a new government could control the situation? Could democracy survive the pressure? Could the different communities live together? And there was a deeper geopolitical question. The Second World War had just ended. The old European empire were beginning to weaken. The United States and Russia were becoming superpowers. And China was moving towards a revolution. Asia was actually entering a completely new political era. And suddenly, there was India, a huge country, strategically positioned between the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, with an enormous population and the leadership that did not intend simply to become somebody else's client. To foreign observers, Jawaharlal Nehru was not simply India's first prime minister, he was becoming the face of the new India. Robert Trumbull later described Nehru as an extraordinarily popular leader, capable of drawing enormous crowds. Foreign observers were fascinated by him. He was an educated Indian, educated in Britain. He spoke the language of Western diplomacy. He understood European politics, and he was also an Indian nationalist. He was actually attempting something unusual. He wanted to create India. Rather, he wanted India to modernize without simply becoming a copy of the West. He wanted independence to mean more than just the replacement of power, replacement of British officials with the Indian officials. India needed political independence, but also it required economic development, social transformation, industrialization, scientific advancement, and international autonomy. All these things are extremely important. India was refusing simply to choose Washington or Moscow at that point of time, and Nehru's India wanted room to maneuver. This would eventually contribute to the politics of non-alignment movement, but in the late 1940s, the world was still trying to understand as to what that meant. Was India going to become a Western ally or a Soviet ally or something completely different? Well, there was one thing in 1947, perhaps the outsiders, particularly the Western people, could not fully see, and that was the election. Because India's first general election happened in 1951-52, but the foundations were already being built, and this would become perhaps the greatest surprise for the Western people. India did not decide that first we will become rich, then we will educate and become educated, eventually we'll become modern, and finally we'll become democratic. It actually attempted something far more ambitious. It chose democracy while it was still in a very poor shape. It chose universal adult franchise, and that meant that ordinary people, ordinary adults, have the right to vote, to choose government, regardless of wealth, caste, gender, religion, or education. It was actually astonishing to the Western world. However, it could be seen as an astonishing political gamble too. In fact, British colonial administrators had regarded mass democracy in India as extremely impractical. The scale alone was terrifying. Imagine how you would register hundreds of millions of people. How do you conduct election across villages, forest, mountain, and even in deserts? How do you reach people who cannot read? How do you explain the electoral system? How do you build that trust? These are the questions. How do you create a system in which poor farmer has the same political vote and power as an educated elite? Well, India would attempt it anyways. And when the first general election finally happened, the reaction abroad was remarkable. New York Times called it as an unprecedented experiment in democracy. Manchester Guardian described India as taking a leap in the dark towards democracy. And even the Washington Post observed that the outside world would watch the election with a mixture of wonder, concern, worried because of the sheer improbability of this experiment. But that is in 1951 and 52. Our story begins in 1947. And that is precisely the point. The gamble had already been made. Well, there was another problem. What exactly did the West think India was? For centuries, European descriptions of India have been filled with contradictions. India was imagined as the land of ancient civilizations, the land of Maharajas, the land of poverty, spiritual mystics, the land of snake charmers, the land of Gandhi, the land of famine, the land of enormous wealth, and the land of enormous suffering. All these images existed simultaneously. And they created a strange problem. And I repeat, they created a strange problem. Foreigners could look at India and completely misunderstand what they were seeing. Well, Robert Trumbull later observed that many educated Indians actually believed Americans still imagined India through the stereotypes of snake charmers, jeweled Maharajas, fakirs, and wild animals. But in 1947 was forced that image to change. India was no longer merely a colonial position. It was becoming a political actor. And suddenly the world had to take seriously a country that had previously been described by the outsiders per se. Now Indians were describing themselves. Here is the paradox. The image of India that traveled around the world was not just the image of Nehru standing at midnight. Well, it was the image of Gandhi. And then Gandhi was murdered on 30th of January 1948. Only months after independence, a foreign correspondent, Robert Trumbull, was again there. His report described a country stunned by the assassination of the man who became internationally associated with India's independence and its non-violence. And the assassin was Hindu, and that fact mattered enormously because it shattered the simplistic foreign narrative that India's problem was merely Hindu versus Muslim. The violence was more complicated. India was struggling with political extremism, communal suspicion, displacement, and competing visions of nationalism. And Gandhi's assassination forced the outside world to confront another question. Could the new India survive without the person whom many outsiders had actually regarded as its moral center? Well, the answer would be yes. But nobody in January 1948 could actually believe it. Now we can finally answer the question. Foreign observers did not have one prediction. They saw at least 5 possible futures for India. If you consider the first one, they believed that India could become a fragile post-colonial state, a country divided by religion, scarred by partition, economically weak and politically unstable. That was the most pessimistic possibility that they had actually thought of about India. If we look at the second possibility, they believed that India could become an authoritarian state. Many newly independent countries eventually moved in that direction. Then the argument was familiar. A poor and divided country needs a strong government first. Democracy can come later. India could have followed that path. In their third vision for India, they believed that India could break apart based on its linguistic, religious, regional and political diversity. And those diversities was enormous. And partition had already demonstrated how quickly political identities could become a territorial conflict. India could become a major Asian power. That's another possibility. Its population alone gave it extraordinary potential. Its geography mattered. Its civilization mattered. Its political leadership mattered. And its ability to remain independent of the emerging superpower blocks could give it a unique role. And the last one, what the Western countries predicted as the future of India, was perhaps the most extraordinary possibility. That India could prove that mass democracy was not a Western monopoly. That democracy did not require a small population. It did not require a universal wealth. It did not require one religion, one language. It did not require a cultural universality or uniformity or homogeneity. India could potentially prove that a deeply diverse civilization could construct a democratic state. In 1947, that was not an established fact. It was purely a hypothesis. This is what makes 1947 so fascinating, because today we know what happened next. We know India survived. We know that the constitution was adopted in 1949. We know that India became a republic in 1950. We know that the first general elections happened in 1951-52. And we know for the fact that democratic system actually survived enormous pressure. But the foreign observers standing in Delhi in 15th August 1947 did not know any of this. He was looking into the future, predicting the future. They believed that the future was uncertain. The British Empire had ended, but the Indian experiment had just begun. And perhaps the greatest irony of this was the people outside India was asking, can India govern itself? Can India govern itself? But Indians were asking a different questions. And I would like to make more emphasis on the point that what Indians were asking, they were not asking that whether they can govern themselves. Rather, they had already decided that answer, perhaps. The question was, what kind of country will the Indians will build? Because now that nobody else is governing us, this distinction mattered. Because independence was not just the final chapter. It was the moment when responsibilities began. The British could no longer be blamed for every failure. Indian leaders now had to deal with poverty, with refugee, communal violence, border, princely states, food, education, industry, constitution, democracy, and also with the foreign policy. And the question that every new country eventually faces is, what does freedom actually means? So what did the foreigners see when India became independent? Some saw a magnificent civilization awakening. Some saw an impoverished country facing enormous obstacles. Some saw a democratic experiment that might fail. Some saw a geopolitical power waiting to emerge. And some saw a tragedy of partition. Some saw all the things at once. Robert Trumbull saw the lights of Delhi. Margaret Bourke-White saw the refugee caravans. Louis Heron saw the violence of partition. Foreign newspapers saw the political gamble, and the world watched. They simply watched. But there is one thing that they could not see. They could not see 1950. They could not see the Constitution. They could not see or predicted of election where a mass population would participate, irrespective of gender, caste, economic background, educational background. They could not see millions of ordinary Indians standing in queue to vote. They could not see India surviving wars, famines, political crisis, and enormous internal contradictions. They could not see whether the experiment could succeed, because on 15th August 1947, India's future was still unwritten. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember about independence. It wasn't the day India proved what it was. Rather, it was the day India began proving what it could become. The world was watching, and nobody yet knew the answer. In 1947, the world did not know what India would become. It only knew that for the first time, India would have to decide for itself. And that was the real beginning of independent India.